the other one? Nope. That one's on, isn't it? Okay. You guys hear me all right? Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Smith. So I've been coming to this event, I think this is my 10th one to attend, but it's my first one to actually present at, so that's pretty exciting. And as Ray mentioned to you earlier, I'm going to be presenting about some research data that we did looking at what information horse owners use when they go to purchase hay. And I hope that you find this beneficial in reaching out to that horse market better and finding a way that you can really utilize them to sell hay products too. So just going to give you some basics of what we did here. So as Ray's mentioned, we actually had 2 different surveys. We did one that was about, that we sent out to hay producers, such as yourself, and we asked things like, what size packaging do you have? What kind of information or what kind of questions do horse owners ask? And if you use preservatives or not. And then on the horse survey, we asked a lot of people about why do they feed alfalfa or why do they not? What information do they use when selecting a hay or when purchasing from a specific buyer? Or from a specific seller. So for the hay side of things, we sent it out to industry professional or industry organizations, and we got a pretty good response, right? We had 36 different states had some kind of response for us, and about 340 hay producers. So we felt like that was pretty good data. On the horse side, we also sent it out on Facebook. And we got a lot more responses, so over 700. And I think Ray was a little frustrated that we didn't get as many hay responses. And I'm like, well, that's because horse people like to talk. We like to talk about our horses, and so they're very, very willing to complete these kinds of things. So 45 states, 3 Canadian territories, we felt like we had really good response from those horse people. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of the most key pieces of information from that, and then we're going to talk about how you can apply that information to your specific operation. So one of the things that we ask people is, what do you use to select your hay? How do you decide what bale of hay or what bale of alfalfa you're going to purchase? And obviously the first one is cost, right? So everybody knows that at the end of the day, we've got to maintain our costs. We've got to keep those low. Lots of horse farms are not in it for profit, right? And that's a little different from cattle operations. We know we're throwing our money away. We know we're not going to make any profit off these horses, but it still means we need to be cognizant of what those things cost. So that's pretty expected, okay? The second most important thing to horse owners when selecting what hay to purchase is the reputation of the dealer. Now, does that surprise anybody in here? It surprised me, right? So I was very surprised that they are more interested in your reputation and what their friends are saying about you, and if you're going to stand behind your product when it's sold and that sort of thing. So the reputation of the dealer is really, really important to these horse owners, okay? It is more important than the size of the bale, okay? And I would argue that bale size is still a very, very important factor to horse owners. Most of them look like me, okay? Do you think that I can pick up a 75-pound bale of hay? I can one time, but not 30 times, okay? So I can take one, but that is it, right? So bale size is a pretty important thing, okay? A lot of these farms are also really small. They only have a couple of horses. They might have a tractor, probably doesn't have a front end loader. They probably don't have a skid steer or anything like that. Really hard time unloading those big, heavy square bales or even round bales, okay? So bale size is a pretty important thing. Other important things, availability of the quality analysis really didn't rank that high. Okay, and then finally, delivery was really low on the list. Why is that? Because we can take a 3-string bale of hay and cut the strings off, and I can put it in the back of a Rogue. Okay, I've done it, and I will tell you for the next 5 years, you will be vacuuming hay out of that Rogue. Okay, but it can be done. All right, so now where do horse owners get their information about forage quality and about feeding hay in general to horses? So number one answer, university personnel. Well, that makes me really happy. That means that I'm doing my job well and people are listening and they're valuing my input, and that's a good thing. Second most important source of information for horse owners is you guys, okay? The hay supplier. They are looking to you to explain to them the forage quality, to help them match the right kind of hay to the right horse, and how to feed that hay and utilize it so that it benefits their horses the most. That is more important than our extension publications. It is more important than the internet, which is a big thing, right? It's even more important than the veterinarian. Okay, so they're really looking to you guys to learn how to utilize that hay, to pick that hay, and to feed it to their horses. Okay, so another question that we ask horse owners is, why do you feed alfalfa or why do you not feed alfalfa? Okay, so on the ones that do feed it, 48% of them said it is a good source of nutrition for their horses. Now, we would say a pretty similar thing with cattle, right? That's why we feed it. It's nutrient dense, very palatable, they like it, right? Why would we not feed alfalfa to a horse? Because the nutrient content is too high. So does anybody see a disconnect here? Okay, so this is where you would say, okay, horse people are crazy, right? And we are, but there is some validity to this. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of conflict in that. Is alfalfa a good source of nutrition for horses? And the truth is that some horses it is and some horses it isn't. Okay, and that's what we're going to look at next. Okay, so let's take a step back real quick and let's look at the overall market, the horse industry in Kentucky. Okay, so this is from the 2012 Kentucky Equine Survey, and they were looking at what counties have how many horses. And obviously, the ones right around Lexington are going to have a whole bunch, right? That's where the breeding farms are. That's where we have lots of horses. But you can see there's horses spread throughout the entire state. Okay, so there are horses all around you. Most of them are going to be smaller farms. Okay. And if we look at the numbers, 242,000 horses in the state on 35,000 equine operations. But if you do the math, that's less than 7 horses per operation, okay? Which means there's a ton of really small farms out there, 1 or 2 or 3 horses. There's some that are mid-sized farms like mine that are about 15 or so, and then obviously there's those really big ones. Now the big farms, the big thoroughbred farms that you see on the postcards, those are going to be very much like cattle operations. They need a lot of hay, they want it in big squares, they need excellent nutrition, they want really consistent product, right? But the farms that I think represent the most potential for you to reach are going to be those smaller farms that currently are buying whatever they can find on Facebook, and they need a little bit more information about making good choices for forage selection. So let's look a little further into that market. You can see that about 54,000 horses in Kentucky are thoroughbreds. Now we know that we're the horse capital of the world. We're known for those thoroughbreds, but it actually means that just a little over 20% of the horses here are actually thoroughbreds. And the vast majority of those are going to be in racing or breeding situations. And so a lot of these other breeds out here are not doing something quite as intense and therefore may not need quite as much nutrition. If we look at here, the #1 use for horses is trail riding and pleasure. That just means you hop on them, drink a beer, you go ride down the hillside, right? That kind of thing. So we do have some competition horses. Obviously, there's some racing horses and those kinds of things. But just because the ones you see on the postcard is what we're kind of known for, that's not what the vast majority of the Kentucky horse industry is. Okay. So first I want us to look at some similarities between cattle and horses, and I will be very open. I am not a cattle person. I have owned cattle because my husband bought them. So I know a little bit. I've learned a little bit being around this crowd, but I'm primarily a horse person. But let's look at a few things. Grass grows the same way regardless of what eats it. So if you know how to grow grass and how to make hay, make good quality clean hay, then you know how to produce horse quality hay. Okay? It is no different. Horse quality hay simply means it is what the horseman desires. That's all that it is. Okay? So if you know how to put up good hay, you can do it for the horse market just like you can for cattle. Okay? We need to match the animal's needs to the hay type. So who here is going to feed their very best high-value alfalfa crop to their dry cows? Probably not going to do that, right? We're going to save that for our lactating cows. Right? And we're going to feed that lower quality stuff to our dry cows or growing heifers, something like that, okay? So same thing with horses. We need to match their needs to the type of hay that we're feeding them. So that's why those race horses are going to need that high-end alfalfa hay. And then those horses in medium work, they're going to have some good mixed hay, right? And then those idle horses, those retired horses that aren't doing a whole lot, they can just have this demi-grass stuff, okay? And then finally, the best indicator of forage quality is animal performance. And that's no different in cattle and horses. If the horses aren't eating it, if they're losing weight or significantly gaining weight, then that is not the right type of hay for them. If they cannot perform their job because they don't have enough nutrients or too much nutrients, then that is not a good hay choice for them and we need to make a change. Same thing for cattle. All right, so now let's look at a few things that are a little different in horses compared to cows. One, gain is not a good thing. So we very, very rarely talk about average daily gain in horses, unless we're talking about growing horses. The vast majority of them need to maintain their weight, okay? So we need to let them do their work, not get any fatter because they are athletes. At the end of the day, I don't sell horses by pounds, right? I sell them based on their production and their performance, okay? So this horse is obviously very fit, doing what he's bred to do. This horse, on the other hand, has clearly had too many peppermints, okay? And he needs to lose some weight. And very similar to people, when we get overweight horses, we get lots of additional health concerns that are problematic for those horses. We're going to look at a couple of those, okay? So gut management is key. So I've hung out with enough forage people and cattle people to know that the rumen is really important, right? We talk a lot about the rumen in cattle and how we need to make sure we know what's going in and know what's coming out. Horses are the same way, it's just reversed, okay? So they have their hind gut fermenters. So up here they have a stomach kind of similar to ours. It breaks down nutrients. It's absorbed into the small intestine before it goes into the cecum, which is the site of fermentation in horses. So it's in the hindgut, so it happens after. And so when we get the balance out of whack of how much is being digested in the front versus the back, then we can have a lot of issues in horses. And predominantly that's going to be colic in the back end, it's going to be gastric ulcers in the front end. And those are both pretty serious conditions in horses that we need to address. Colic, for what it's worth, is simply belly pain. Okay, so babies get it, and it's a lot of times it's when the guts are twisted around or they're impacted, something like that. But one thing that I found was really interesting that I didn't know about horses, even though I've been a lifetime horse owner, is that horses don't have visceral fat. So they don't have fat that holds their organs in the right place, which means it gets twisted up a lot easier than it would for, say, you or I or a cow. Okay, so that's one reason why horses are so susceptible to colic and why GI upset is like the #1 issue in horses. Okay. The last thing is that carbohydrates are a really big deal in horses and really just in some horses, okay? So there are a subset of horses that have something similar to diabetes in people, okay? And so we often call it equine metabolic syndrome, sometimes it's called insulin resistance. Sometimes it's not really diagnosed as anything specific, we just call them metabolic, we'll call them laminitic prone, we'll call them crusty necked, those kinds of things. And generally those horses are gonna have this big crest on their neck. They're going to have lumpy fat deposits all over their body, and it can eventually cause something called founder or laminitis, which is when this bottom bone right here, the coffin bone, actually rotates. So there's inflammation in the foot. That bone rotates down, and it can eventually pop out the bottom. This is a debilitating disease and often ends up in euthanasia if it gets bad enough, or if it's a little bit more marginal, we can treat it with corrective shoeing and whatnot. But it's a pretty big deal in horses, and it all goes back to carbohydrates. So when we look at our hay test here in a second, I'm going to show you how we manage these kinds of horses. Again, this is just a subset. The vast majority of healthy horses, they don't have to worry about carbs, but there are some of them that do. So you'll hear people talk about that, especially if they're asking for Timothy hay. So Timothy has gotten the rap of being like the low sugar hay. And if it's harvested correctly, it can be, but if it's not harvested correctly, it can have just as much sugars as anything else. So let's look at a hay analysis. And this is something that isn't actually in your proceedings, so if you wanted to take notes or take a picture, it might be a good one to do so. First of all, this analysis is a little bit different. It was done through Equine Analytical, which is part of Dairy One up in Ithaca, New York, instead of doing something like through KDA. So Kim does great testing of hay. Unfortunately, they don't have some of the parameters that we're looking for in horses. So I wanted to show you what a horse version would look like. And this is something that hopefully horse owners are getting more and more familiar with looking at, and therefore I think you should be familiar with it too. So most of it is pretty similar to what you look at in cattle with a few differences. One is we report energy as digestible energy, or DE, okay? And we're looking for that number to be right around 1 megacal per pound. For light work, it might be a little bit more. For growing yearlings, it could be 1.3. Lactating mares, we can be up to 1.4 megacals. Okay, so that kind of gives you a good range of, is this hay going to have enough energy for my horses? Okay, and energy is the #1 thing that we want to balance on. So I've got some fat, overweight horses that are retired and they don't really do a whole lot. And so I'm really looking for hay to be a little less than 1. Because I don't want them getting too fat and getting some of those metabolic issues. So that's what we're looking for with energy. Okay, the next one is that NDF, again, directly related to intake. We're looking for that number to be less than 60. Now, I've got a quarter horse. She's fat. She'll eat anything I put in front of her. I swear it could be 75 and she'd eat it. But most horses, you want to be 60 or less to really make sure you're getting good intake. Okay. So this is the part that's probably most different with horses, is this WSC, or water-soluble carbohydrates, and then also the starches down here. So when we add water-soluble carbohydrates and starches together, that's what's going to give us our carbohydrate measurement. And we typically want that to be somewhere between 11 and 15 or less for those metabolic or sugar-sensitive type horses. And I gave you a big range here, 11 to 15, because truthfully, we don't know exactly what that number is. The vet clinics are usually more conservative. They say 11. The nutritionists will say a little bit higher number, but we definitely want that number to be pretty low. for those metabolic horses. So again, if it's a racetrack horse, we're not worried about it, but if it's the fat pony for your neighbor's daughter, that's the kind of horse that we might be more concerned with that, okay? And then the last thing is that calcium to phosphorus ratio, and I don't actually know if that's an issue in cattle or not, but in horses, that calcium phosphorus ratio is pretty important, and we need it to be somewhere in the 1:1 to 5:1 range. If it's more than 5:1, it's going to be really hard for us to balance that out using like a ration balancer. And so we have to be really careful with that. And I thought this was one of those things that never happened. And then I actually had a load of hay recently that tested 8:1 in my barn. And it happened to be hay that I had purchased to feed to my growing horses, which is the ones that need that proper ratio more than anything. And so we had to go through a pretty big exercise of balancing out that ration, adding in some grass hay, and making sure that we were able to get those ratios back in check for them. So that's another really important one to kind of keep an eye on. Any questions on this slide while we're here? It's kind of a lot. Okay, awesome. So here's the big difference between selling hay to cattle farmers and selling hay to horsemen. It's the people. So if you Google cattle farmer, this is the kind of picture that you're going to get on Google Images, right? These two guys, they're hanging out. They probably graduated college a couple years ago, and they're chilling with their cows. They kind of look a lot like you guys right now, right? But if you Google horse person, you're going to get something like this. Right? So what do we notice? What's different about the horse person versus the cow person? What is it? Yeah, one's got long hair, right? Right? So she's female, right? So she's a woman. She's younger, right? College age, right out of college, that kind of thing. She's really happy too, isn't she? She's down there with her horses and she's real happy hanging out with them. The horses do not look thrilled. But she's happy, right? And these two guys over here, they're fine. They're hanging out with their cows, whatever, right? So this is the big difference, is that you're selling to a totally different market of people, right? We love buying our hay on Facebook. We love taking surveys and telling people about our horses. I posted on Facebook yesterday asking about pictures of people putting hay in their cars, and I was flooded with pictures of horse people putting hay on top of a Toyota Camry kind of thing, okay? That is what horse people do. So, in summary, the sky is the limit, okay? There are over 7 million horses in the United States, and they all need hay, okay? They all do. That's just how it is. 85% of horse owners have to purchase hay at some point, okay? We are typically not agronomists. We typically don't do a great job of managing our pastures or growing hay for that matter, and so we rely on hay producers like yourselves to purchase that and to do those things. And over 35% of hay producers that we talk to sell more than 75% of their hay to the horse market, which means there are a lot of hay producers out there that is their major market, is horse owners. So it is certainly possible to do, and it's a good market that's worth pursuing. So I think with that, I will take any questions that you have. Dr. Teutsch. Yes.
So we as hay producers, especially for cattle, stress doing things to improve hay quality. Does that need to go the other way for the horse hay market?
So that's really going to... Oh, right. Okay. I'll repeat the question. So he was asking that, do we need to take all the steps to improve hay quality when we're growing for horse hay instead of cattle hay? And I would say it depends on the farms that you're selling to. And that's where you need to really know your client. So if you're going to be selling hay to Lanes Inn that has 200 mares that they're foaling out and they're looking for high quality alfalfa, absolutely. It needs to be dairy quality, very high end, high value hay. If you're selling hay to me that has a bunch of retired horses that don't do anything, no, I don't need that, and I'm not going to pay for it. That's the thing, is I'm not going to pay for that really high quality hay. So I think you kind of need to know, and I think you need to be realistic about what you have. So if you take a cutting, it wasn't as good a quality as you thought, maybe tell Lanes Inn, hey, this stuff isn't good enough for you, but I bet I can find some people down the road who might use it. Yes, ma'am. That's a great question. So the question was, what percentage of horse farms purchase their hay from out west? I don't have any actual numbers on that, but what I can tell you is that a lot of the big thoroughbred farms in Lexington are buying Western hay, no doubt, okay? They like that they can get big bale sizes, that they can get consistent product, that sort of thing, and they can get it every week if they want it, right? That said, I do know of some larger horse farms that are buying more local hay, some of them from producers right here. So I think there's the opportunity for more local hay, especially as shipping prices increase. Those small farms like me, I'm not going to be buying Western hay. The only way I'm going to do it is if I'm buying it from a retail store, and you really, really pay for it that way. So I try really hard not to. So honestly, goodness, Facebook. That is where we buy and sell so much hay. That is most of my hay comes off of Facebook. It really, truly does. You can find a lot of information there. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. What kind of grasses do I recommend for pastures for horses? Not Timothy. So Timothy does not not do great as horse pasture. It's great hay, wonderful hay for horses, really not good pasture grass. So we're typically looking at, in the Lexington area, you're looking at tall fescue, preferably a novel endophyte tall fescue, especially if you have brood mares. We're looking at bluegrass, and we're looking at an orchard grass, a little bit of perennial ryegrass sometimes. But the biggest thing that I see people putting in that doesn't typically work out well is Timothy. I know there are some places that graze alfalfa with horses. I don't typically do that. It's not very common in this area, so it'd be pretty hard to see that in this area. Yes, ma'am. The way the question was written, I think it pretty much spoke to that. So her question was, did you look at why people feed it and then, I'm sorry, say that again, why people feed it and then do they actually? Right. Okay, versus something else. Okay, so what percentage of horse owners actually feed alfalfa versus something else? That wasn't something that we asked in the survey, so I would assume those that say that they do feed it, therefore must purchase it and do so, but yeah, we didn't look at that specifically. I do love that it's all women asking questions, by the way. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Horse people have a lot of opinions. A lot of opinions. So it's hard to say which one is the one that everybody wants, right? So alfalfa, orchard grass are pretty common, right? Timothy's pretty common hay. I think people like a lot of straight orchard grass hay. More people feed fescue hay than they realize. I think we like to call it bluegrass hay. It's not, but that's fine. We'll go with it. So no, I don't know that there's like one specific one. I think horse people have so many opinions that it's just good to talk to those people. But I think kind of your standard mixes are pretty good. Horse people don't like to try something new sometimes, so I wouldn't go crazy and do something really off the walls, at least to start with. Yes, sir.
How did you do a presentation on selling hay to horse people without using the word green hay?
It's a good question. So he said, how did I do a presentation without saying anything about green hay? Yeah. So horse people certainly expect hay to be green, right? And does green automatically mean that it's good hay? No. Probably is, but it doesn't mean that it definitely is. And that's something that my job on the horse side of things is educating horse owners and saying, look, you can look at the hay and you can probably take a pretty good guess at its quality, but we really need to get that hay test to have that really good quality. So one of my goals is to make sure that having that hay test moves up in priority for horse owners over time. And that's something we've been working towards and trying to educate them on the importance of testing their hay and testing their soil and testing their fescue, those kinds of things too. Mm-hmm. And it probably could have been or should have been. I would agree with that, but yeah, we did not include that. Mm-hmm. Is it? Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Right. So that's something, if we did a follow-up, that would be something to certainly consider is is looking more into that color. But again, that's something that we're hoping to encourage people to not base their decisions just on color, right? But if you don't have a hay test and you're standing there right now and it's deciding on the hay, then that's what you have to work with for sure. Yep. My husband recently railed against preservatives. Ray, I don't even think I told you the story. My husband bought some alfalfa hay, and he was like, "Oh, this stuff doesn't have preservatives, and you see how much more natural the color looks, and this other stuff they got like green dye in that preservative." Like, I don't think that's what I actually think it was the other kind of hay that was preservative treated, but I didn't say anything. But I agree, like there was just such a perception that this hay is super green, and therefore it's very different. But the analysis were actually very similar. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody here get anybody that just absolutely refuses hay because it has preservatives on it?
So that's an interesting question. He was asking about do horse owners actively refuse hay because of preservatives? And I didn't present that data, but here's what we found. The vast majority of hay producers said that they put preservatives on their horse hay, and the vast majority of horse owners said they don't buy hay with preservatives. I'm just saying. I'm not saying don't lie to them, but I wouldn't mention it. I'd just roll with it, right? Because I don't think that they're aware. I don't think they're aware of how common it is. Obviously, if they ask point blank, then yeah, I'd be honest about it. But yeah, do you have any additional comment to that, Ray? Mm-hmm. Yep. I think GMOs in grain, like in horse feed, is another can of worms I'm trying to stay away from. So, anything else? Yes, sir.
As far as the horse test you posted,
Mm-hmm.
is that its own test, or like I get a standard hay test on most of my hay,
Mm-hmm.
the RFQ, RFD, and a few others.
Right.
Some of that I really pay close attention to see if that's on there. Do I have to kind of request those?
You typically have to request them, and I haven't done tons of testing at lots of different labs, but it seems like most labs don't do those carbohydrates, and so you have to especially request those. And in some cases, if they're doing like NIR, they may not have the equation to do that, and so you'd have to go to a different lab for that. And then the DE, the digestible energy, Ray or Jimmy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's just a different calculation of energy. It's not actually a different analysis. But again, you'd have to request that. So that lab that I use, it's a division of Dairy One, which probably some of you are familiar with, and they do it a little differently for horse people and put horses on the pictures and those kinds of things. So,
and that analysis would have the normal parameters.
Yeah, they would. They'd still have all your basic ADF, NDF, protein, moisture, all that kind of stuff. And their like most basic test includes the sugar and the sugars and the energy. And I want to say it's like $20 for samples. It's not too bad. And they have like the pre-made mailers that you can have on hand, that kind of thing. So, yeah, if you're selling to a lot of horse people, and especially if they're asking for that information, that would be something to consider, sending samples off that way. I test all of my hay when I buy it. The problem is that I've already bought it. And so then it's not which hay do I pick, it's how do I compensate for this hay if it's lacking, or in some cases has too much sugar, then I have to soak it, and that's not a fun thing to do. So. So it's a different order form, and even though it goes to the same lab in Ithaca, it's a totally different form. So when if you search for equine analytical, They have like their own web page, so it looks like two separate companies, and that's just because horse people like to be special. And so you just pull that up and request their mailers, but it'll have a different form on it altogether. It has a little equine logo.